just. All right. Welcome to Digital Art After Dark with Brian and Mark. I'm Mark, and this is Brian. Brian, how do you do?
Oh, I'm doing just great, Mark. Thanks for
right.
asking. How are you?
Oh, about as well as can be expected. Thank you very much. So, why are we here?
Well, we are here to hopefully learn something, I hope, or, at least be entertaining to a somewhat degree.
No promises.
No promises, though.
Not either.
Yeah. Well,
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm Brian, as you might know me, and or as you've seen me in the title Rhunyc. That's how you pronounce it. It's very fancy. I do art. I'm an artist. I like to think I'm an artist. People seem to enjoy my work sometimes. It's pretty fun. Thank you. And a little bit of background. I'm a Fargo native. I'm going to school for computer science. Nerdy stuff, pretty fun. I like video games, and I like to draw. And Mark, do you want to tell them about yourself? Tell yourself some stuff.
I wasn't ready for this. All right, my name is Mark. I'm a digital artist. I'm an author. I'm an illustrator. I'm a puzzle master. I'm an amateur programmer and roboticist. And I am here.
He's way cooler than me.
For Brian's emotional support.
Yes. In case I had a nervous breakdown, he was going to caress me and make me feel better. So.
We discussed that no touching.
That's okay.
All right.
I'll live, I suppose. Just Anyway, so how many of you guys here are artists, or any beginners? Yeah. Okay. Well, I know you're an artist. I know you're an artist. I know you guys are artists a little bit, yeah. You dabble, and then So hopefully, I'm just gonna go through some basic stuff here and kind of do like a live demonstration since there's a small crowd. Probably gonna do some fun impromptu doodles, and this is also a no judgment zone, a judgment-free zone, if you will. So any questions you have at all, just feel free to ask them. Don't be embarrassed or whatever. I'm an open book, and I'm sure Mark is too. He has plenty of experience, and if anybody else has any advice or experience, Tyler, you can you can chime in as well. So it's an open discussion, and
all right.
So. To get started, this is the device I use.
Brian, what are you using there?
What am I using?
Yeah.
Thanks for asking, Mark.
Yeah,
how thoughtful of you.
Yeah.
It's called a Wacom Mobile Studio Pro. It is a fancy piece of equipment that has everything inside of here. Normally with a Wacom device, they're usually, in the past, now they're moving to like this, but they used to be just the monitor, so, or just a little pad, and you'd have to have a computer and everything in addition to it. But this is all built inside of here, so it's really nice. A little hefty, pretty penny, so you have to save up for it if you want, But it's been a really good device, really intuitive, and it's really compact, and I can put it all in.
And about how much did that cost you?
$3,000. So it was good. It was hard to save for, but once you did and you get it, it's worth it alone for the size of it and traveling, because before conventions I'd bring my whole Cintiq 24 HD, and that thing was a beast, weighed over 80 pounds, and then I also had to bring my computer and everything else with that too, so that was quite the hassle. So this is pretty nice. So anyway, what I'm going to be doing is kind of showing you Photoshop. That's what I kind of like learned digital art in. And I know Mark here also uses Photoshop.
I do. Now, are there any Photoshop alternatives?
Mark, I'm glad you asked. There are some alternatives. I don't know if there's a lot. There's some. I don't know all of them. I do know that there is Clip Studio Paint, and then there is also GIMP, which is a free software. I've heard it's pretty comparable to Photoshop. And then there's also Sketchbook Pro, I think, is one of them. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yep.
Sketchbook something or other. Yeah, those are some alternatives. And I've also been I just recently got Clip Studio Paint, which is it's coming up to be a good competitor to Photoshop because it's built for the artist and for like painting and creating art in it. Whereas Photoshop, you know, obviously was made for touching up photos. It wasn't intended to be a fully fledged artistic program. But that's kind of what artists adopted it for because it's really versatile and you can have your custom brushes and all that fun stuff, which I will kind of get into when I show you stuff. But yeah, so I've been using Photoshop and I'll kind of explain how I do things and what I do.
How do you start?
How do I start?
Yeah.
You're so kind.
Hey,
I like the way you're asking me these questions. It's very inviting. Thank you. So basically how I start is first I come up with an idea. Sometimes I don't even have an idea. I just go for it. I just start with a blank canvas. But usually when you start, you go up and you hit new. This is some really advanced knowledge. You might have to write it down. But this should open up with some options, but it doesn't want to show me any options. So we're just going to go ahead and close that. And this is my welcoming message. This is something I doodled at my booth. Ooh. But for the sake of there we go. This is what it should look like. All these options, these beautiful things. So what I have my own custom size here, which is what I do all of my prints in. I do it in 12 by 16 inches. I know some artists, I don't know if you are this way, but like to memorize the pixel dimensions in their pieces. Do you do that?
I don't memorize the pixel dimensions. I do memorize the general dimensions. I usually go 11 by 11 inches.
Yeah.
But more importantly for me, I like to go at 400 DPI.
400?
400.
Why 400?
Because at 400 DPI, I feel a little more comfortable blowing it up if I have to.
Oh, yeah, there's that extra detail.
I don't have to very much, but there's an extra level of detail that makes me feel a little more comfortable. Mm-hmm. And then generally I wind up shrinking it down to either 5 by 5 or 8 by 8 anyways.
Yeah. Which it's good for the details and stuff like that. Yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
I am different. I usually work at 300 DPI, which you can see here, the resolution pixels per inch. And if those of you who go by pixels and stuff, you can select that, different options there. But I usually just memorize by inches because that's my print sizes. It's easiest for me to do. And 300, the number, the parts per inch, or pixels per inch, or dots per inch, or whatever, is just the quality at which it's going to print. So the higher the resolution or the higher pixels per inch, the better quality it's going to be.
Yes.
So if you were to do it like really small pixels per inch and you did it like 11 by 12, it would just be really pixelated. So
I'm just going to take a quick aside here. When it comes to DPI, if you're going to be printing your work, 300 DPI is more or less the baseline.
It's the standard.
Yeah, that's about as, you don't really want to go much lower. Mm-hmm. But if you are just doing stuff for the web, you can go ahead and do 300 DPI, 400, whatever you want, but you're going to have to shrink that down to approximately 72 DPI.
Yep. So that's good information. So anyway, so I have my custom size 12 by 16. That's what I always work in, or sometimes 12 by 12. But usually it's 12 by 16, and then I'll just go ahead and start new, and then have the blank canvas. And then typically, so if you're not familiar with Photoshop and how it works, layers are essential to work with. They are good for organizing your image and making it so you can play around with things and not worry about affecting the overall piece, because you can just remove the layer, switch the layer, you can do all kinds of things.
If you were to describe a layer using real-world objects, how would you do that?
That's a good question, Mark. I would say if you had, this is putting me on the spot and making things up that I'm not really sure, but I'm just going to throw something out there. Okay,
right,
so if you have, let's say, pieces of glass, like windows, right? You have your window, and you're like, oh, I'm going to color on this window. So you color on the window, and you're like, oh, I want to color underneath that. So you put a window underneath that window, and you color on that window. And then you have these layers of windows that you can see through. And then whatever is on top, and you can order them in the stacks of the windows, and that's kind of what I would say.
Fun fact, that's actually a method of animation that was mastered by Disney. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, multiplanar animation.
Maybe that was a subliminal, because I've seen that video before where the making of those things, Anyway, so layers are your friend. I know when I was beginning in digital art, I would just draw right on the background layer, which can be kind of disastrous in a way. Not disastrous, but it's something that is not recommended because everything on the background layer is the background layer. So like, I can't go underneath anything if I want to. I have to basically, well, I can because it's the background. The background layer is the bottommost layer. Everything that's on there is just on that layer. You can't.
Right.
Yeah.
The background layer is, think of it as the canvas, the actual canvas, the solid piece. As soon as you make a mark on there, you're either going to have to paint over it or start anew.
Yep. So now with this, since I kind of did it, I'm just going to edit undo just a little bit there. And then, yeah, so with like the layers, obviously you can do that and then make a new one. And then just, well, this is a bad example. Let's do a different color. Kind of go underneath that. And so obviously, hopefully you get the concept of layers by now. So that's kind of what they're good for. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. I have this downloaded image I made of a tutorial I did years ago to kind of give you a good quick overview of the process and like what the steps I usually take, things like that. So this is the first page. You'll see the final image when I get further down, but this is the first stage of it. You can kind of see this is like the most important part of an illustration, and it looks the worst, which is kind of funny because for me anyway, like one thing I forgot to say as a disclaimer, I'm a self-taught artist. Things I say aren't law of the land. There's wiggle room. You can make up your own rules. It's just whatever works best for you. This is the way I've learned, and this is what works for me. So take things what I say with a grain of salt. Hopefully it helps. I don't know. But anyway, so for me, this is like a really important part of the process, and that's just formulating your ideas and getting a quick, like, just a scribble of things and just kind of like feeling everything out. And basically the idea with this image was it's an aliens piece with a xenomorph. And so here's a dude. This is actually supposed to be a dude. And then here is a door, and then here is a xenomorph. And that's just like me throwing, well, I can swear because this is 18, but throwing shit down. So that's just me just throwing things around, and I don't know if that's kind of your process too.
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing for almost every composition is the thumbnail sketch. If you don't have this foundation set before you start, the entire thing is going to fall apart in the end.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chance it could work out. You know, there's always like things that do fall in place, but you know, you usually want to have a good foundation and kind of a good layout of where things are going to go. So I just basically blocked in this weird thing that's kind of the shape of a guy, and then like kind of placed that. And so that's basically the first step, and I think it's important to point that out because when you're starting with digital art and you want to get better, like it's kind of discouraging to like draw and then like not be like super happy with what you're drawing, and you're like, oh, I suck, I'm never gonna get better at art. And because you know you can't just draw the best thing right away. You gotta work for it. And they start out terrible, but then you make them better. So anyway, oh, that was fun. So here's 2 more steps. Basically, after I did the top step there, I kind of went and I took that layer I drew on, and then I lowered the opacity quite a bit. This is something that's really handy to do because you can, well, obviously you lower the opacity so you make it a lot dimmer, and you can draw under it or over it, and it kind of like shades. I'll give you an example here. So let's say with this here, I'm gonna just draw this black thing. So this is my sketch of a thing here. I don't know what it is, but this is a thing. And then I'm like, oh, that's a cool thing. I want to like make it better. So what I usually do or would do is then I lower this opacity here. I'm gonna get rid of that here. If you have something to say. I did sound like you're saying something.
So this is actually very similar to what a lot of comic artists will do. They'll start with what would be considered a pencil layer. Now, of course, this is not a pencil layer. This is just going to be a lighter layer. Now, as you can see, what he's doing is he's drawing on top of that layer. He's adding more detail. He has the basic form, but he needs to add more detail on top of that. And I'm guessing he'll probably do that a few more times.
You're correct, Mark. I do it a few more times. as you'll see. But anyways, this is kind of the gist. So like a lot of artists will draw silhouettes like first, like also like they'll draw silhouettes of things, and so because another important part of art too is understand the basic shapes of things. You know, you don't want to worry too much about the details of a thing if the overall shape doesn't look like a thing you're trying to draw, you know? So like people will try to draw recognizable silhouettes, and then they'll draw over those silhouettes like this with the lowering opacity and stuff, so you can add those finer details. I don't know what this thing is, but you know, there could be this thing here, and then there could be a thing there, and then this thing here, and then, you know.
So the silhouette theory is a very important concept in character design.
Yes. It's a good way to establish a character's overall look without defining them, right?
Correct. Yeah. The whole idea is, can you identify who that character is by just the silhouette?
So it's very important to understand that too. Anyway, going back to this little image here, so there's my rough sketch, and then using the whole lowering the opacity and stuff like that, you can kind of tell there's that crappy xenomorph, and there's the wall, but instead I went over it and kind of adjusted like the dimensions of things, because up here it was just flat. Like there was no 3 dimensions, it was just the character facing back against the wall. Here's the door and here's the thing, but then here I was like, I need to add some depth, so I added like an angle here for the wall, so there's perspective, and then I also turned the suit a little bit, so it's like, you know, he's not facing you, he's facing away, and then like his head, you can see in here, is kind of like looking to the side a little bit, and then I added a little more rough sketch detail there, and then I just kind of got a better feel for what I wanted to do with the piece. And then after that, what I'll usually do when I'm kind of satisfied with the overall rough sketch, I'll then transfer over here where I lay down some flat values of things, like to get the feel of like lighting and, you know, what parts am I gonna emphasize, things that I want to draw attention to, stuff like that. And that's usually the best, like lighting is usually the best way to do that. Like you want to have high contrast to things that you want people to look at and draw their attention to, and like you want things, I don't know if this I did a long time ago, so I don't know if this is the best example, but like yeah, and like things that you want, you know, you want them to, you know, when people look at your picture, you want them to explore it. You have the thing that you want them to look at first, and then you have other things around it that kind of add to the overall image.
My cousin once described it as, imagine yourself in a dark room, all right, with a single source of light. The thing your eye is attracted to most will be that single source of light. And vice versa is true. You're in the middle of the desert, and then there's a dark cave.
Beautiful.
Your eye will be most attracted to the darkness.
Yeah. So that's one thing. And so, yeah, so that's kind of what I did here, is just got those basic values and just kind of played with the overall look and feel of what I wanted to do. And so after that step, usually then I'll go into a more refined, and another key thing to do also as an artist or an illustrator is to always flip your images. Like always flip them constantly, because one thing I've learned is if you look at something in the same way, in the same field of, you know, whatever, it's gonna be skewed because you see it. You like, and this happens to my drawings all the time. So if I don't flip it right away, or if I don't constantly flip it, I'll notice once I do flip it, it's like leaning to the right or leaning to the left. And it's like, if you're just staring at it from the, you know, one view, it's gonna be skewed a little bit. So that's one thing to always remember. So in some of these screen captures, you'll notice it'll flip back and forth, but that's kind of what I do, is just to get so I don't make sure nothing's slanting or the perspective or proportions aren't messed up. So yeah, and so here myself too, I'm not the most I don't know what the word I'm trying to think of is.
Structured?
Structured, yeah. Wow, you can read my mind, Mark. So I'm not the most structured artist. So sometimes my process will just go all over the place. Like, you know, when you're making things, for me, sometimes I just like to go with the flow, and that flow is sometimes different for each piece. So sometimes, like as you see here on the left, I have all those shadows and lights, and then on the right, they're gone. Like, where'd they go, Mark? I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking. This was a long time ago, but I'll try to explain it. So Anyway, so I think what my mind was going to here was I added a little bit more depth, and then I kind of defined the suit a little bit more. And I I flipped it obviously, and then I just added a little bit more details, I think, and then I went back and I lowered all the opacity of that again, and I kind of went over top of that again and added even more details. Like my line art's not very good most of the time, so usually in my paintings I have line art, but that's just to help me like figure out where the details end and where they begin and things like that, and then I can paint.
Sidebar, Your Honor.
Yes.
Yes.
Granted.
When you add more detail, do you ever pull from references, or is this completely from your brain?
Another thing, references are your friend, or your damn friend, and you.
Your damned friend?
Your damn friend.
You gotta save
Sorry,
that friend.
This is not family friendly.
Oh my goodness.
We need to swear here. Okay.
I
gotta remember to do that every now and then.
You haven't hit your swearing quota for the night.
I had 2 beers before this, Mark.
Oh,
I'm trying to start to get rowdy.
Ooh.
Anyway, what's that? Fuck. Shit. Okay. Anyway, so I kind of went back and added a little more detail, and like I said, to kind of place where I was going to paint certain things where, and so that's that kind of step there and what I was doing there and why it went from like all that fun shading goodness to not so much, and then the weird lines. That's why. And then here we go, 2 more. After that, I was really happy with how things were looking in terms like the details and things like that. Like I knew over here like where his face was looking and like how the shapes and things were like all that, and like kind of like, oh, this guy looks terrible here, but like kind of where his mouth and all those things were going to be at. So after that, I go back and then I start actually like rendering these things a little bit, since I have a pretty good foundation and I kind of have a really good idea and feeling about what's going on with this piece. And so that's where I'll actually go through and I'll paint on top of all of my like sketchy layers, or sometimes I'll paint underneath if I don't want to affect the line quality. So that's the nice thing about layers. Like I said, you know, you can do up, above, below, you can change whatever you want. And so sometimes it's nice if you want to just throw down some colors or some shades underneath or on something, you can just do it underneath the lines. It won't touch the lines, you'll still have your lines there. And then you can do your details on top of the lines and over them. So that way you can, you know, tweak your line art and tweak your details and make changes as you go along and further refine it. And so this is kind of what I was doing there. And then over here, I did even more refining because I was like, wow, I'm on a roll. This looks pretty good. And so I added more details on the xenomorph here, and then I kind of shaded in here. His face is gone, but it kind of comes back a little bit. And then I also got, I just did more detailing here, like filled in the shapes more, just minor adjustments here and there. And then after that, more details, I guess. I just keep going to town on these details. One thing also with the beauty of Photoshop and layers is, as you'll notice, I'm working in black and white here. A lot of artists will work in black and white before they apply color. I know some crazy brave souls who just jump right into color and bless their hearts, because that's really hard to do, and they must know what they're doing. I am not one of those people, though I try sometimes. Go ahead.
So there is a very big benefit in working in monotone first, and that has a lot to do with, as we were discussing earlier, controlling the contrast. One of the big mistakes a lot of people make when working in color is not really
paying attention to the values and the saturation of things.
The value of the color, yep.
Yeah, because if you work in colors directly, you might have muddled colors, or you might not have the contrast you're desiring, even though it looks like it is contrasted because of the colors. But really, if you turn it black and white, oftentimes it'll be just sometimes,
Can we give them a live example of this?
Sure, let's try. I'm not too brushed up on my color theory, but why not? This is a small room, who cares? Okay, so let's say, oh yeah, I could do this, duh. So here we go. I got a red color here. Let's just throw that down. That looks good, right? Can I have an applause? Thank you. Wow, I feel really good at this. Okay, and then I'll have a green color right next to it. and then there's a little bit of overlap, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at that and you're like, wow, those colors there's light and day.
It's very festive.
It's very festive. I feel like this is Christmas, but
Yeah.
it's not Christmas. I don't know what happened. And then let's just I'm just I'm just gonna do it this way. Let's just do a black and white here. I think that'll work. And then you'll see there's like no difference between the two. And so if you kind of keep that in mind with like another thing, like I know there's a way to do it in Photoshop, but I don't really know how. I see people do it, and I'm just like, I'll just do it the hard way every time.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a way to do it where you can open up the same image and then apply this black and white filter to it, and then you can have it like in the corner. Do you know how to do that? Are you a wizard?
Oh, I know one way to do it.
You do?
I'm not entirely sure what you're talking
Kind
about.
of. Okay. Well, I don't either. Sometimes.
Do you want to learn? Do you want to learn something?
Yeah, show me.
Alright.
Show me the.
Bring
the
up your regular. Get rid of this nonsense.
Get rid of this. Okay.
Well, no, not like that. Just back up a few steps.
Oh.
I want to see the color.
Yeah,
There we go. All right. So one thing that I'll do a lot. So you either use black or white
So smart.
on the very top layer. And we'll switch the layer property to color.
There we go.
That way we can just flick it on and off.
What a wizard. This is why he's up here. So, he's not just emotional support. He helps me. Anyway, so that's one thing to keep in mind is the colors and saturation and how they kind of play together and making sure that they're not flat images when they're black and white. Because if you do that, they might look good, but they could be much better if you work with the values and the things. So like instead here I could kind of get a little bit of a darker or something like that. I don't know. And then, well, this is, I don't know what this is, but it's something. And there's still, and then you can kind of like bleed them together. Another thing too, if you're not familiar with what I'm doing here, on my tablet I have a shortcut set to the Alt key. And the Alt is a fast way of using the eyedropper to pick colors. So when I first started doing this, I would manually pick the eye color and then pick the color and then draw a couple strokes and then go back and pick the eyedropper and rinse and repeat a ton of times, and it was really really tedious. But then I found out about the handy Alt shortcut. If you hold Alt on your keyboard, or if you have a shortcut like I do, you can just let go of Alt and then you just pick the colors and go, and then you can just grab colors as you go, and it makes it a lot more streamlined. Because when I first started, I didn't know that, and I was like, how do people like not go crazy with all of these colors? But and so after that, you can see there's a lot more depth and variety there because of the saturation. And I don't know, this isn't anything in particular, but you
Much
could
higher contrast.
Yeah, hopefully you could see how
Oh,
like
I can see something there. Yeah, it looks like a parrot and a coconut.
Oh, you're too kind, Mark.
Yeah.
No. So you can see there's a lot more depth there. Anyways, so that's kind of what the whole idea about starting in black and white is, so you can have a better grip on your values and on your lights and darks and contrasts and things like that. So anyway, getting back to this here, like I said, just more details. Painting over using. And the majority of this piece was done with a single brush, I believe. It was a...
Brian, what
How
brush
would
do you use?
Mark, I use so many brushes. In Photoshop, well, actually I don't. That's a lie. I have a lot of brushes. I have so many brushes. But like in Photoshop, you can import your own brushes. There's a plethora of them available online for Photoshop, especially, which can also be used, I think, in GIMP. And there's another one that they work well with. I don't remember what it's called.
Brian?
What?
What is a brush?
That's a great question, Mark. So he keeps me grounded. You're my anchor, Mark. So brushes are basically, there's a handy dandy brush tool which I've been using this whole time, and brushes are another way to alter the way your thing works. So
Your strokes.
your strokes, yes, that's the word. So with online resources, like I know a really big one is DeviantArt. That's where I got my brushes. And there's this artist. He works in like the film industry. His name's Jonas DeRoe, and he shares his brushes for free. Anybody can use them, and they're pretty high quality. And then there's also plenty of other artists that do that. I mainly use the ones he shared. So if you want the same brushes, feel free to talk to me, and I can tell you again what they are and how to get them. And
So to simplify that,
yeah,
what Brian is doing is he's using the brush tool, and by saying different brushes, we're talking about the different settings the brush itself, the brush tool can have
yeah,
to emulate a more traditional brush.
yeah. So you can add texture, and you can play with like the way it scatters and the opacity, and there's a bunch of different settings. Let's see, where are the brush settings?
There are custom brushes to emulate watercolor brushes,
Yeah.
to emulate oil brushes,
Yeah.
ink.
These are all the
brushes.
different settings that you can edit and modify for the brushes, which I never really got into making brushes or playing with that, but I've seen what people can do with it, and there's some really cool brushes that people have made. But I just download the brushes. They're free to use, and you can use them for whatever you want to use them for. And there's a lot of really fun textures, which, as you'll see in my artwork, people will often ask me if I work with like oil paints or watercolor, and I'm like, no, this is all done on the computer, and that's thanks to brushes I use. And so, just as a demonstration here for some different ones, this is one of my favorite brushes. This is called the Ink Big Brush from Jonas DeRoe. It's a very, very good name. And this has like a canvas texture to it. So when you're drawing, it just applies this texture that looks really nice and gritty, I think. And so it's really fun and that's what I did this silly little doodle in at my table was just with that brush. And it's like, you can see it adds, there's with a lot of pieces like this isn't a good example, but there's a lot of implied details that like textures and brushes can give you that you don't have to manually do yourself, which is really nice.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like this brush here, for example, and then there's also, I'm gonna get rid of this here, if I can there. There's also, go ahead.
And of course, all of this is based on your style preferences.
Yeah.
If you wanted to, you could use a 100% hard round brush, and if that's what you like working with,
Yeah.
that's great.
All-
Honestly, that's what I work with
Yeah,
most of the time. Yeah.
I mean, the brush, like going back to the original question, I normally use is one that's called Palette Knife. It came with, I think, Jonas DeRoe's brush pack. And this is just a plain round brush that has this slight opacity to it when I work. And it's really nice because it's good for blending. So like I can get really hard strokes there, and then I can lighten it up a little bit, and then grab like a middle color, and then kind of like get a nice gradient by just like lightening, and it all works with the pen pressure. That's one thing with these tablets is they have pressure sensitivity built into the pens, and so they can detect. So if I push really hard, it gets darker, like dark, and then if I push really light, it's light. So
it's just like if you were pressing a pencil against a piece of paper, the lighter you press, the lighter the stroke, the harder you press, the darker the stroke.
yes, and that's one thing with the brush settings too. You can modify what it does based on how you do it. The pen, it stays the same opacity, it's really dark, but it'll get bigger or smaller if you push harder or lighter. So, but yeah, this is the brush I used for a majority aside from this ink one. I would switch between the ink and then this one based on what I was going for in my piece. I think in the piece I was doing here, it was mostly with this round brush. And then there's also, like I said, there's a lot of brushes, and there's some brushes that you don't want to, they're just there for special little final touches on things. Like I'll often use like this debris. I have debris brushes, which are really nice for like you just kind of like do that, and then it kind of like adds this extra texture. Like for like some of my pieces, I have like disintegrating characters or like a lot of clouds and dust in the background, and so this really helps to kind of add to that without having to go in and just do it for each little one, you know. So There's always all kinds of brushes, and then there's this, let's see here, chain brush, which one of my artist friends would always joke about because it's just like, well, who needs a chain brush? But there's a chain brush, so you can just draw a chain. You don't have to actually draw each of the links, which is really, it's really time saving because, I mean, yes, I could individually draw every link to prove that I can draw the links, but what good is that? Why not just use the chain brush and get the idea across and save yourself 20 minutes, you know?
It's a very good base.
And then you can, it's as a base, and then you can go in and then paint on top of each one of these to give them a unique feel, and then that way it's not like I just use the chain brush, job done, you know? So, yeah, so there's all kinds of different brushes, and like I said, with the Jonas Day Row brush pack, there's just really good ones. So if you're interested, let me know. I can give you a link, and you can play with them and learn about brushes. So, yeah.
So now the image you were working on, the xenomorph one,
Yeah.
I noticed it's very black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Do you add color?
Yes, that is something I do.
Oh.
You'll see that I add colors right after that. I add colors, and
Hey, Brian? Hey, Brian?
What?
How do you do that?
It's magic.
Okay.
No, that's not magic. It is actually, well, it's kind of magic. It's back to the layers. There's several different layer options to use to add color to a piece. I'm fond of either this overlay, there's a overlay, multiply, and then also just color. I don't know which ones you use. Do you use any different ones?
I use almost all of them.
Almost all of
It really
these?
depends on it depends on what I'm trying to do.
You are a layer connoisseur. I just use those three and that's it.
Oh.
You are a wizard. Anyway, so using like an overlay layer, this is one example, you want to throw it on top of the thing you want to color, and then basically you pick actually I'll just use a color example because that's like straight colors. Because overlay and multiply are two different things. They kind of do the same thing, but there's a difference between them. And it's kind of hard to, I don't know, can you explain it? Do you know the difference between overlay and multiply? Because overlay, yes, you go ahead. You're probably more eloquent than that.
So, what each layer? What is it? Layer style, layer setting.
Layer style, yeah.
What they do is multiply will add on top of the color. So if you have 50% gray, it will add on top of that, however much, in this case, brown, you're adding in. Overlay will integrate it into the layer underneath it. Screen will kind of, oh Lord, what's the best way to?
Brighten it, right?
So it's kind of, it's the difference between, what is it called, additive color and, close. No. Let me do a different example. It's the difference between mixing colors with light versus mixing colors in paint. So if you were to take a red and a blue and mix them together paint-wise, you get a purple. Light-wise, you might still get a purple. But if you start adding in all the other colors with paint, you're just going to get a brown, muddy mess. Whereas with light, you'll get white.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's good. So yeah, as you can see here, I kind of took a color layer and threw it over top. And if you'll notice, it doesn't affect the white. Why is that, Mark?
which one are you using?
Just the color layer.
Color?
Yeah.
Because
Put you on the spot. You put me on the spot.
I know. Because with the white already has all of the colors. What you're doing is you're adding the green color to the items below it. Since white already has green, it's not going to show any green. Whereas since the gray, isn't, it's a medium, it's going to come out to be green.
Yeah. So that's kind of how that works. And then
And the same with black too. It's going back to the example of mixing all the light together versus mixing all the pink together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of on both ends there.
Yeah. He's really good at explaining these things. I just know how they work. Like I don't know the science behind it. I don't know how the words to explain it. I just like play with it. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what that does. And it's like, so explain. I'm glad you're here to explain these things because
It's funny you say you don't have the word. I am struggling to pull the words out of air, so obviously I don't have the words to explain it either.
It's okay.
In this moment.
But yeah, as like a basic kind of thing here, like adding these layers on top of each other, you can get some really neat effects by blending different colors in different ways. Like with the overlayer on top of the color layer, you can see there's some nice. I'm using like this blue, and over this yellow or this orangish color, it makes it green because of the way it blends. And then like if I wanted to make another artist, that I've learned, we'll use like multiply layers for shadows. So if you want a shadow of something, let's say I want this shadow, a lot of artists will just take the color and then add a multiply layer on top of it, and then just do that. And then usually it's a pretty good starting point for your shadows. So just take the same color on a multiply layer, and then you'll have pretty nice shadow-like effect because
now,
it just darkens.
That will work primarily for using a neutral light source. So if your example, here we have a yellow light shining down upon us, as you notice here, the base of the mic stand has a little bit of a yellow glow behind it, and it's dark because that's where the light isn't hitting. If it were to be a red, I'm not going to use that term, but the light would bounce off, and you'd have more of a brownish, reddish shadow there. You'd have a reddish glow there. So you can still use multiply for shadow, but be conscious as to what light you're using. Even if you are just using a white light as your primary source, you need to think about, well, what is that white light bouncing off of?
That's some good shit, Mark.
Sorry.
No, I wanted to swear because I got to keep the swear quota up.
You're not meeting your quota, man.
I know, that's why I had to throw
We're
that
falling
in there.
behind.
Fuck.
All right.
So, okay, so this is kind of going off of that. This is what I did here is I added, I think it was either an overlay or color. I'm pretty sure it was overlay because I didn't know what I was doing. I was just playing at the time, and I liked how it looked, so I just went with it. So I added an overlay layer, and I had my blacks and whites underneath there, and just adding that color on top of it. You know, you can see that there's a lot of like contrast and stuff. And I don't think I changed the colors too drastically between this here and that there because of the blacks and whites underneath. So it's like I said, working in black and white first, you know, and when you add colors, you already have that built-in contrast and saturation and all that good stuff because of that underlying foundation. So, and then after that, we got some more stuff here where I kind of just, like it says here, I pushed colors and details more and more. Like after that initial pass with the overlay layer where I add that first batch of colors, I then will either add another color layer on top of that to further modify things and kind of like mute things or a multiply layer and add darks, things like that, and just slowly add more definition to things. And kind of like add details too on top of that. Like I'll have just a normal layer on top of these color and overlay and stuff, and then paint with those actual colors, because if you try to modify those colors on those layers, it'll kind of throw you off, because let's say you want to work with this orange and you're working on the multiply layer and you grab that color and then you color with it, it's going to be a different color because it's on that layer. So usually you want to have like a normal layer that isn't a modifying layer that you actually do your painting on, because you're grabbing the colors and you know what they are and you can use them. So that's kind of what I did here is, you know, adding that initial color and then going over it and then using a normal layer to add details with more color variety and more depth, because once you have the initial base layer of colors and it all looks good, then you can modify the colors, you can tweak, you can be like, oh, here's an orange, I want to grab like a slightly redder orange that's darker, and then that can be like a lower light or kind of thing like that, and then you just play with it a little bit and then build that depth and things like that, and before you know it, you add more details and get right in there. And that usually, like with art too, zooming in the beginning stages of a piece is generally a bad idea. because chances are you're going to have to change it. So it's always a good idea to work at a big picture kind of way, like what I've been doing here. I mean, this is whatever, but usually you want to work where you can see most of the picture. So that way, if you like change things, you can see how it reflects the piece as a whole. And another way you can do that too is there's what's called a navigator window, which is obviously a window that you can open, and then it'll show your whole piece, and you can shrink that down if it will shrink. But oh wait, I can probably just do this. There. So like I can zoom in, and I can make changes, and I can see kind of how like it affects the piece as a whole. So that way, like I don't throw anything off balance, or like it doesn't make things like too much, draws the eye in the wrong place.
It gives you a broad and a narrow perspective simultaneously.
Yeah.
So maybe there's going to be something you wouldn't notice detail-wise from a broad perspective.
Right.
So that's when you need to go in with the narrow perspective to take a look and like, oh yeah, no, this tooth is going in the wrong direction or something.
Yeah, yeah. 'Cause
Whereas
up close it looks
Yeah.
great, and you're like, oh, this is perfect. And then you zoom out, and you're like, well, that's not what I fucking wanted.
yes, and then there's that too. It's the converse where
Yeah.
you're
And then
so
you swear
focused.
at your computer.
Yeah.
You say, God damn it, son of a bitch.
So, yeah.
Sure, you can relate, can't you?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
I just had a computer die on me.
I know. So
yeah,
he was in Swear City.
I lost a book.
He did lose
That's,
the
yeah.
book.
So, but yeah, it's exactly what Brian was saying. You can, if you work solely on the narrow perspective, then when you back up, you'll notice that, oh no, this is going in the completely wrong direction. I was not paying attention to the overall perspective of the piece.
Yeah, because like you
example.
can draw what looks up close to be like a really great looking mouth, and then you zoom out and you're like, this doesn't fit the face at all. What was I thinking?
This mouth is going in a completely different direction from the rest of the person.
You need to swear too, Mark.
Poop.
I mean, that's good. That's a good start.
There we
Well,
go.
Yeah, this is your co-hosting. You need to keep the swear. You need to do that too. It's
No,
not just me.
no.
Okay. Anyway, continuing. So yeah, after you have that groundwork and you know everything's working well together as a whole, then you can zoom in with the navigator there to keep you in check and just go kind of crazy with details and add things like these aren't the best details. This is old stuff, but they're details nonetheless. And so this is where I kind of got in and added those touches. Further along in the process, not in the beginning, And usually when people sit down when they're beginner artists, they're like, yeah, I'm going to draw this right away. And it's like, no, you're not. If you do, it's going to be kind of weird, I'm sure. If you do, I mean, maybe you're really good, and that more power to you. You can do that. But chances are, you gotta take your time and build a foundation first, which is good. But yeah. Anyways, you do you. If it works for you that way, do it that way. And then after all that hard work, you finally have an image that actually looks okay. And that's the final piece. So kind of with that, are there any general questions or specific questions that anybody has? Yes, Tyler.
Put this piece next to your original thumbnail.
I can sure try. Let's see. I think. Oh no. Let's just open two. Can I open two of it? Yes, I can. Hardest things. Yep. You learn it. No. That's not what I want. I want to do. What am I doing? Shit. Thanks for the beatboxing, Mark.
Hey, you're welcome.
You're really good at beatboxing. Okay, there we go. I figured it out. My phone thinks I'm talking to it. She said, "I don't understand." Well, that's okay. You don't need to understand. Okay, can we stop doing that, please? Please.
Should
What do
I,
you want from me? There we go. Okay, I figured it out. There we go. So this is the side by side that was kindly requested by Tyler.
So you went with your flipped?
Yeah, I did go with the flipped overall. Yeah. That's another thing to think about. There's kind of like a unspoken rule, or maybe it's spoken. I don't know. I just read it somewhere one time. Rule about like how you place your characters kind of tells a story.
Yes, it does.
I don't really know that rule. I
Oh.
just do what feels right, and I thought this looked better than him on the left.
Can I?
Yes, you
All right.
absolutely. You know these things.
So, very much like reading a book, a person will typically read a picture or an image from left to right. So, in this scenario, the main subject of the piece we can infer is the xenomorph, and then it goes on to the unnamed astronaut. If you were to flip that, you would infer that the astronaut is in fact the main character, and then that would in turn give the xenomorph a little more of a menacing air to it, because all of a sudden now you're identifying with the astronaut. You are moving on and then seeing this fierce piece afterwards. So, in that sense, there are other ways to do that too. It's also based on, not just whether it's left or right, whether it's big or small, whether you're looking at it from a high angle or a low angle. All of this will give you different information on the character. At least it will infer it.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's a really good way to kind of set your piece up also. And then another thing too that's really important is balance in an image.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this is the best example again, but it's good to kind of have an idea so you don't like overcrowd things, or like you want to play with negative space, and you want to play with like where you're positioning things, and you want to pay attention to how you're placing things in your illustrations, because it could really come off as not so fun to look at, in lack of better words. Shit. So you need to swear.
That's
Mark.
just gratuitous.
This is 18 plus. I can do it. So anyway, so yeah, that's one thing to be really important or really mindful of, because sometimes you'll see illustrations that you'll have an awkwardly placed character on the far left of an image, and it's like there's all this space, and you're like, why is there all this space and nothing to look at, and why am I only looking at one little corner of the picture, when it's like you could be utilizing that space better. You could fill the image, and then another little rule is like a rule of thirds. And this is kind of adhering to that. The best way to explain it is if you split the image up into a grid of 9 boxes, evenly placed boxes, you kind of want to have something at the intersection of any one of the corner boxes. So like here, I have kind of the head of the xenomorph. It's more in the center, and like I said, I didn't really follow that. But over here, you can see I have the guy's face kind of right in the center of that cross, where the grid would be. So it's good to be mindful of that too, because it kind of helps you keep in check the balance of your image. So.
And there are a number of different ways to use the composition to your benefit. For example, in this piece, Brian has framed the xenomorph within the piece itself by,
Yeah.
you have a frame right there, so that kind of helps pull it out. We go back to the contrast. You have the lighter background and then the darker head, so the head pops out. It also helps that the rest of this is dark. What else do we have? As he mentioned, you have the rule of thirds, so you have main subject there, secondary subject there. The lines also help guide the eye, going from top down. So you can see as you move across, you may be a little, what would you call that? I don't know. Hazard lines, whatever.
Yeah, like
are kind of like
warning strips.
Yeah, guiding your eye back in this direction.
Artist words.
So.
yeah, and then also the contrast too was a big factor in this. Adding, with that foundation of the black and white, and then I could add these colors on top of it. I knew that, this was my main focus basically, and then this was also a focus. These big block areas, I mean, they do provide contrast, but it's not so like, it's not like a over, like with the dude here, yeah.
You have contrast, but you also have balance.
Yes, and this is like a very pointed contrast. Like there's tons of little details and contrast in those details, whereas this is just like a big block of contrast where it's like, it doesn't really draw your eye. It's nice to have in there, so it's not just like all this dark empty space. And then so that's kind of with that. But yeah, so was there any other questions? I know we kind of like, yes, go for it.
So when you first started doing this,
Uh-huh.
how long did it take you from concept to completion, and
Mhm.
how long is it taking you?
Oh, that is a good question. So for this one, I actually think I did this remarkably fast for the time. I think it only took me actually maybe it wasn't as fast. I think it was like around I'm bad at remembering time frames. But I would say probably like 10, 12 hours was for the full thing. And I think I did it in a single sitting in a day because I really liked how it was going and I felt really good about it. And I was like, yeah, I was actually happy with it. And so, but now, usually my pieces take sometimes that long. There's a lot of things I've gotten a lot quicker with. For instance, like detailing and things like that. A lot of this was when I was getting really serious with illustrating and painting. So I was spending a lot of time like learning the ropes and like figuring out, how does this brush work? How does this layer work? And like now it's like I know how that works. I know how this brush works, and like I can use those how I envision them rather than like I want to make this thing and then I have to find the things to make the thing, So there's that extra step that's taken out. So I can do it a little bit faster, but I mean now they still take about the same length, but I can add more stuff because of that extra that difference in skill, I guess. But yeah. How long do your pieces take, Mark?
Well, that depends on the subject and the complexity of the piece.
What would you say an average time would be?
Ooh. Well, again, that depends on the subject and the complexity of the piece.
Come on, Mark. That's not an answer. We want answers.
Okay, so
Damn it.
if I were just doing a subject without a background, that can take me 4 to 6 hours. If I were to do a simple subject with a background, let's say a simple to moderately complex background, then we're talking probably closer to 6 to 10 hours. If we're talking about a complex subject and a complex background, then anywhere from 12 to 28 hours. The longest I've ever worked on a single piece, oh boy, probably 48 hours.
Which piece was that?
The 6-banded armadillo.
That's a mouthful.
That was 6 hours a day for about 8 days. So 24, 48, yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
That was horrible.
Any other questions on that? Yes, go for it.
For people that want to start dabbling
Uh-huh.
with digital drawing, things like that, do you have a suggestion for like what tablets to start with or what?
Sure. If you have the extra money to buy one that has a built-in display, I would recommend that because it's going to feel more natural and intuitive. I know there are cheaper alternatives available than when I first started doing this. Usually Huion it's building a name for itself as like a good alternative to Wacom, which is the name brand. Everybody, that's what I have. Because it's good, I guess. But the Huion is a good alternative. I know there's other brands too that run in like do you know what the prices are on those? Like for a smaller one, is it like a few $100s or something
For
like a Huion like 13-inch or something?
I haven't kept a close eye on those.
That's okay. Well, if you can find one, usually you find them for a lot cheaper than the Cintiq comparable one. Otherwise, if you don't want to like invest that much in the beginner, setup, which is totally understandable, you can also buy just the regular like Intuos or Bamboo or I'm sure Huion has their own version, which is just a pad that doesn't have a screen on it, but comes with a stylus that senses pressure, and it's basically set up so that the part on the pad where you move the pen is in relation to the screen. So it works. You have to build a little bit hand-eye coordination at first. It's going to be. I hated it at first with mine. I had a Wacom Bamboo. That was a nightmare, and I hated it. And I wanted to give up so many times, but I'm like, you know what? People do it. It's okay. I'm just struggling. It's fine. And then I eventually figured things out. And so with those, it's a little bit of a struggle bus at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's like second nature. Like I did this one. I did on that. I believe. I think I did this on that. Just a little bamboo, Wacom Bamboo. It was tiny. And it was so old. But it worked. I mean, they're good products, and they last a long time. So I would recommend like something like that if you're not willing to invest a lot. But do you have any recommendations?
A couple, yeah. Well, first and foremost, one of the best, maybe not best, just an exercise that I'd often get through. Here's a distinction. Unlike Brian, I actually went to school for a degree in art, so I had to take a lot of art classes. A lot of them were boring. That's fine. I had to learn a lot of fundamentals. And one of the exercises they would often throw at us is, hey, draw this, but don't look at what you're drawing. Look at the subject, but don't look at the paper. Because oftentimes, again, going back to narrow versus broad perspective, we're so focused on what we're drawing that we don't pay enough attention to the subject. That said, because of that, when I started, it was just called a Wacom. They didn't have any distinguishing, they may have had numbers, but it was just a Wacom. It was a 13-inch pad.
They were called tablets back then, but now
Yeah.
tablets mean a different thing. So.
Completely different thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I started with, just a 13-inch tablet and then my computer screen. I think that's a really good thing to do, to learn to break away from your direct eye-to-hand coordination and to kind of broaden the overall coordination between your hand and eye.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very weird way of saying it. But
Now you have to swear.
fart.
Oh, so close.
So close.
Started with the poop, and now you're going back.
But I think that's a very powerful exercise for any beginning artist to actually do. That said, eventually you'll want maybe to graduate up to an actual screen. I use a Cintiq 12WX. Now, here's the thing. He paid $3,000 for his. Back in, 2009. Oh my goodness, it's been a decade. 10 years ago, I bought my tablet secondhand from the, what was his name? Mitch Breitweiser, the Captain America artist at the time. It was an old Cintiq 12WX. It still works. It cost me $900 then. That was a lot of money for me at that time. Mm-hmm. I've used it pretty much every day since. So you don't need to get the newest model. Just get something that works.
Yeah, something
You
that
know?
that fits you and
Figure out what you need, what you want.
Mhm.
I know a lot of artists actually just use their Apple tablet or their Microsoft Surface Pro.
Yeah, that's another thing too. Is if you already have an iPad, like I think it's
Mhm.
iPad Pro that you have to use the Apple Pencil. But if you
Yeah.
already have one, you can
Mhm.
just buy the Apple Pencil, and I know they have Procreate for the Apple or the iPad, which is a really good software for artists, and then also with like a Surface tablet. From
Mhm.
Microsoft, those are supposed to be pretty good too. Even phones now, like I had a Galaxy Note, and that had a Wacom-made stylus for it, and it had a little bit of pressure sensitivity. I was just bummed that I didn't have any keyboard shortcuts to work with. It was just the volume up and volume down button, which I couldn't really do a whole lot with. But some people do really good things with those. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
It's, you know what, it's it's a poor artist who blames their tools. You, uh, I'm sorry. It's true though. Like you can do. You go online. You can see artists doing amazing things with a big ballpoint pen and a coffee cup. You know, you don't need expensive tools to make something awesome.
I mean, they help
They,
a lot, but
they're much cleaner.
Yeah.
They're much more convenient. You can
But-
experiment and iterate a lot faster
Yeah.
than with other things. But
you don't need them.
you don't need them. You just need to find something that works for you.
Yeah. As long as you have the drive and you want to learn, you'll find a way and
So.
you make it happen. There's so many resources online available too. Not to sidestep into a different category altogether, but like learning how to use Photoshop. You're learning for beginners. There's so much information out there for that. So.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. Again, let me reiterate: you don't need the fanciest, newest equipment. Just get something that works. From 2000 and what year is it now? 19. So 2007 until 2003 until 2007, I was using Photoshop 7. Like they didn't even have a Creative Suite. They did. That's around the time Creative Suite 3 was out. And then after I graduated, my professor gifted me with Creative Suite 3. So I used that for a number of years. Now I'm using Creative Suite 6. It is still
Pretty good.
it's like the function that you don't need the newest stuff. I could still probably do a lot of what I do with Photoshop 7 because a lot of the bells and whistles that the Creative Suite has right now is just that. It's bells and whistles. It doesn't, there's nothing here there's not a button to make your art better. There's a button to undo, and that's great.
It's better than erasing by hand everything you mess up. So.
But again, Photoshop isn't the only option.
Yeah.
If you want something free, that's great. Krita.
Yeah,
I will
that's fun.
recommend that. If you want something
Heard good
that's
things.
maybe not free but still
pretty
pretty good,
close.
is Corel Paint.
Yeah. And Clip Studio also, like
Clip Studio,
I'm trying to switch to them because of how affordable they are, and how good it is. But it's only I think $50 or $40 for the version I use, and they have a souped up version, but you can do like fancy animations and things like that.
Yeah.
Something I don't use, so that's a little more expensive. But like for $50 and what you get, it's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, and if all you're doing is like pixel art, just like 8-bit pixel art, 32-bit, whatever, Asebrite. I actually have that. No, I used to have that on my computer.
Yeah.
I don't have my new one yet, so
Yeah.
I still have. Oh, I hope I still have the license.
I'm sure you do. They're pretty good.
Oh God.
Yeah. Hopefully that kind of helped answer your question a little bit. Any other kind of questions, or we'll go with you. I saw your hand go up first.
Have you ever worked with 2D art in your art? I mean 3D in your art?
That's something we talked about just today, actually.
Yes.
No, I have not, but I would love to. The only thing is, the software that's available for that is, for me, switching from Photoshop to 3D software, it's such a learning curve that I've messed around with it, but it's really hard for me to like get into a workflow that I can do what I want and stuff like that. But yeah.
I had a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Have you ever actually checked out the stuff they're doing with the game Dreams?
No, I haven't actually.
You should check that out.
Really?
It's a PS4 game
Oh.
that came out.
Is it for the VR too, or is it
It's
just?
going to be VR when
Yes, we just got a PSVR, so I'll play that.
It's crazy what people have done in it
Really?
with art. It's very painterly
Yeah.
and very much like clay.
Oh.
They have brushes and everything in it. I have the early access for it, so
Yeah,
I've
nice.
been working with it. And it's
Really? Oh,
really amazing.
I'll have to check that out. Yeah, we were looking for things to do on the PS4, so we just got one. So
You should probably check out Dreams.
Dreams. All right. Cool. Yeah. And then did you want to have something to add to the whole 3D?
Oh yeah, actually, I have used 3D SketchUp. So I don't do complex figures in 3D. Typically, what I do is if I'm having trouble rendering an object like a physical object in 2D, so for example, if I were drawing Donkey Kong and I had trouble drawing the barrel, what I have done in the past is gone into SketchUp, created the barrel, kind of tilted it so it was at the right angle for my composition, and then I would export that image, pull that into the piece, and then just like what he was showing there, paint on top of that until it's integrated into the whole piece.
Yeah, that's one
So-
thing with 3D art. It's really good for workflow because you can reuse the same thing, and since it's a 3D model, you can position it differently.
Yeah.
And then, already you have a good base, and you just paint right on top of it the details you want to add. And
This past Halloween, I participated in a month-long drawing challenge, and
he's a madman.
I actually, for one of the days, I built a what would you call it? A Jack-in-the-Box in 3D, and then brought that into Photoshop Paint on top of that. For another day, I needed a completely different object. I was just able to pull the Jack-in-the-Box, edit it a little bit, and all of a sudden it became a treasure chest. So,
Yeah, so it's very versatile.
mhm.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you had a question. That's right.
Yeah. Well, I have a daughter. She's about 16.
Uh-huh.
Her spineless doodles can put a lot of people's spinal.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
But I mean, I'm not very artistic myself, but I'm wondering if besides some of the stuff you mentioned already, do you have any other suggestions for somebody trying to support an artist who's not an artist themselves?
What do you think?
Yes. Well, no, it depends on what level of support you're talking about. Are you talking about just emotional support, or are you talking about like helping them develop as an artist? If it's just like being there as a person, yeah, share their work, buy their stuff, go to their events. If it's helping them develop as an artist, there are a lot of amazing tutorials online. You can go to YouTube. Is it Control
Alt Paint.
Alt Paint?
Yeah.
That is
That's another
amazing.
resource.
That is probably the number one resource I would say going to as a beginner. That's what I started with.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of fundamentals.
Younger, I had a lot of trouble because I wanted to support her as an artist, but it's like most of the art classes were like one-off projects.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, that's pretty common, unfortunately. I was fortunate in growing up in high school. I had my senior year of high school. My art teacher was like cool with me just doing whatever I wanted. So I would just go, and she encouraged me. She was like, "Yeah, that looks great. Do it." And I'm like, "All right." So I just draw like weird little characters, and then she got me a computer to like do digital art on by myself, and I was like, sweet. So I just sat and like on the computer by myself. Everybody else was drawing with like colored pencils and whatever. Anyway, but I would say for like supporting an artist, encourage them and like give them good feedback and so, let them know like they're doing awesome, and that you believe in them, because that was one of the big things for me was like, even though I'm sure like my parents didn't really think my arts was that great when I was growing up, but they would always tell me like, oh, that's really cool, or like that, they'd be impressed, and they would make me feel really good. I'm like, oh, I must be really good. I must have a thing, and I just wanted to draw more, and it was really encouraging to have that environment to be around in. So I think that's a really important part is just telling them, when they show you something like, oh, that's awesome, like that's really cool that you made that, what else can you make, things like that. Just being encouraging and giving them nice words. I think that's really important.
Also, if you can find other artists for them to
Find like a group or another friend, and
friends, mentors. As much as I love the support of my family and friends, I knew that I couldn't myself develop as an artist without some harsh criticism, and I knew I couldn't get that from said family and friends. So I go out and just throw myself to the wolves, and that can help.
It can, yes. You just kind of, that's another thing too with developing as an artist. You have to be open to sometimes harsh criticism about your work. Sometimes, you'll make things and you'll think it's really good, but then you'll find out it's not so good, and people aren't afraid to tell you, especially on the internet where people can be anonymous and they can just say, fuck you,
Yeah.
Sorry about the swears, but it's 18 plus, so I'm gonna do it.
Sometimes you'll have the complete inverse too. Like you'll think something's horrible, rotten,
Yeah. and
totally
then-
worthless, and then someone else sees it and they're thinking, "This is the best thing ever.
Yeah, you should
This
run
made
with
my
it.
day." Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, being honest with them too, to a degree, it's important also.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that's one thing, as an artist, you have to grow some thick skin sometimes and be willing to hear that your stuff isn't so good and that it can be improved, and then you just got to learn from it and be like, okay, why is it bad? What is wrong with this? Like, why is it not how it looks in my head? Or why is it, when I look at it, I think it's great, but other people don't seem to like it, and just kind of think about it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that's where a lot of growth comes from, is from recognizing your shortcomings and working on them instead of, just running with it and being like, I'm so good at these things and I'm just going to keep doing these things and not accepting any kind of feedback.
Hey, Brian,
Yes, Mark.
I got a present for you.
What is it?
All right, get this. Artists do not shit roses.
You swore!
There we go. But
Growth, character development.
a good artist can take that shit and mold it into a rose. So
It's deep, Mark. But yeah. Any other questions regarding that? Time? Okay. Yeah, I guess we're running. I guess I didn't have much time for a demo. I was trying to start sketching something so that I could be like living up to the thing that I claimed, which was a live demonstration.
I think
so.
you're just asking if I'd met my step count for the day, and I'm sorry I missed it. Yeah.
So, yeah, if there's no other questions, I want to thank you guys for coming here and listening to us talk and making us feel like we know what we're doing, because it's nice sometimes to have that.
Hey, Brian.
And
Brian,
yeah?
you did great.
Thanks, Mark. You
Hey,
did
you're
wonderful.
welcome. Hey, thank you.
That's good.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks. You, yeah.
Do you want to say where you are in the artist alley? So you do demonstrations where you...
Oh, yeah. If you are curious to see more of my work, I have an artist alley table, and I have my tablet with me, and tomorrow I'll have my monitor. I brought the wrong monitor with me today, so I couldn't demonstrate, but tomorrow I will have some live demonstrations at my table. You can kind of check in. I'll probably be working on a more full piece. Maybe I'll just take this doodle and work on it more, and you can stop by frequently or periodically, however often than you prefer, and see the progress as it develops. And you can kind of see where it starts and all that stuff. So thanks for the question. You were there too.
Yeah, I'm in the market. I have stuff. I've stopped bringing my computer places, so I'll just be sketching. But I can answer questions if you have them, or if you just want to stop by and say hi. That'd be nice too.
Such a friendly guy. I'm just gonna swear at you.
Ha! he's
Damn
not,
it!
He's not lying.
No.
No.
All right. Well, yeah. Thanks, guys, for coming. A big round of applause for putting up with us. You did great. You did wonderful. And
It's all
yeah,
you. It's
that's
all you.
pretty much it.
Hey, have a great night, everyone.
Yeah.
See you tomorrow.
Drive safe.